Hey AP Psych students, it is Megan here with Fiveable. Tonight we are going to be reviewing for your semester exams that are coming up. And so I want to do things maybe a little bit differently tonight. I have a set of slides to go through, different things that I think you should be studying, some reminders about some topics. But if there's anything at all that you want to go over, even if it's something I haven't mentioned, I can do my best to kind of give you some answers and we can talk about those things as well, because I want you guys to feel prepped and ready for your upcoming semester exams. So today, like I said, we're doing our semester review. Next week is going to be super fun. We have a Kahoot review coming up. That is on December 18th, same time, same place. You can register on our website and go live and play Kahoot with lots of other people. Amanda's going to be hosting that, so that should be really fun. And then we're going to take some time off over winter break, and then on January 8th, we're back and moving on to cognition, part 1 and part 2. So tonight then, like I said, we're just going to go over kind of each of the units that we've covered so far, and it's probably going to be a fairly short session unless we have a bunch of questions or things to go over. And then I do have an FRQ prompt as well. So the first unit that we covered in psychology was called History and Approaches. And if you remember, it makes up about 2 to 4% of the AP exam. And so the reason this is relevant is I know that I do this, and I'm sure a lot of other AP Psych teachers do this as well, but my semester final is made up of old AP test questions. And so in order to keep it realistic or true to the AP test, all of the questions match up with the percentages on the test. So 2 to 4% of the questions on my semester exam are devoted to history and approaches, and then the other percentages match up with the other units. So in the grand scheme of things, this is a really small unit, so I wouldn't spend a ton of time fretting and stressing over it, but there are a few things you should think about and maybe go back and review. The first is just the basic famous historical psychologists. Our textbook goes all the way back to like Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. Just make sure you kind of have the gist of the early roots of psychology and who did what. As far as the historical approaches to psychology, make sure you review structuralism and function, big ones. And then that unit goes on to talking about modern approaches to psychology. And that's what this little like pie chart thing is here. So make sure you just know what it means for cognitive factors. So thinking, thought process, humanistic factors, and just go through and make sure you remember all the different fields and subsets of psychology. And there even is typically a small question about job or type of psychologist. So that's the history and approaches unit. One way that I would approach studying for it, like I said, is the early psychologists. And the best way I think to approach this is through the nature-nurture debate. So organizing who was all more nature in their beliefs about early psychology and who was more nurture. So Socrates, Plato, and Descartes are the 3 big names you have to know associated with nature. And so they really believed that things were inborn. Our traits, our personality, our consciousness was all things that we were basically born with, and that's how we would be for the rest of our lives. And our knowledge is innate, we have it, and that's not going to change. On the other hand, we have Aristotle, Francis Bacon, and John Locke, who are the big names, and they were more about the nurture side, how experience shapes us. And there's this phrase called the tabula rasa, which basically means the blank slate. And so the belief is that we're born blank and experience writes upon that. So again, I wouldn't spend fretting about that, but basically just making sure that you kind of know the gist of the nature-nurture debate and who is on what side of it. And then sometimes questions, the other kind of common questions about historical psychologists would be like, who, had the first psych lab, who was the first female APA president, things like that, just those kind of like little trivia facts. So go back and review Wundt and Titchener and Mary Cox and those people. But again, 2 to 4% of your overall AP test, so not a heavy hitter unit, not worth super stressing over. Research methods is the next unit that we covered. And this is a heavy hitter. This is 8 to 10% of your AP test. So there's definitely more stuff to think about and to review from this unit. So I just made a list again of the things I think you should cover. This is like broad topics. Obviously, within these topics, there's more things to think about. So descriptive versus experimental methods. So understanding the difference between a descriptive study and an experiment. The various types of descriptive methods, which we'll talk a little bit more about. Being able to identify parts of an experiment, so knowing what an independent variable is, knowing what operational definitions are, those sorts of things are going to be important. And then the next part is about how we analyze the data that we get from our studies. And so being able to determine a descriptive versus an inferential statistic, so things like mean, median, and mode versus statistical significance or things like that. Understanding the measures of central tendency and not just knowing what they are, but knowing when they would be useful and how I would use them. And then lastly, measures of variation like standard deviation. So this is a broad list. Again, I'm going to highlight a couple of topics that I think are sometimes confusing and that people struggle with. But again, if you kind of cover these broad topics, I feel like you should be pretty set for any semester exam or cumulative test. So the big thing with descriptive versus experimental methods is that descriptive methods describe, descriptive, describe, it's kind of self-explanatory, describe or measure humans as they already are. And so there's no cause and effect from a descriptive method. So you have to be very careful if you're talking about using one of these methods listed, like a case study. You cannot determine cause and effect. You can try to make inferences about the general population based on your study. However, you can't make cause and effect relationships clear without doing an experiment. And then for the specific examples of descriptive methods, so case studies, naturalistic observations, surveys, and correlations, just make sure that you know what each one is and kind of what each one would be good for. Case studies are when we study like one person super in depth, usually because they have some sort of unique circumstances. So that's why we would use a case study. Naturalistic observation is good for studying animals or people in their natural environment without the artificial lab setting. A survey is like a questionnaire that people fill out and we use it to get information about them. And then a correlational study is when we compare two variables to see if we think there may be a relationship there. An experiment then, on the other hand, is more of our true science type experiment. We have variables, we measure their outcomes, and so we're actually manipulating something in a human or in an animal and then measuring the results of that manipulation. And so this is how we determine cause and effect, and that's really the key thing there. And then so experiments are really the only thing in this category. So just make sure you review the differences between those. What are the pros? What are the cons? That sort of thing. Another part then of the research methods unit would be the statistical reasoning that I mentioned. And so I find this little chart or graphic to be useful for organizing my descriptive statistics and my inferential statistics. So if you want to take a screenshot of that or make a copy of this, go right ahead. It would be useful for you to just take a peek at it and remember, what is this measure of central tendency, mean, median, mode? What's a measure of variation, standard deviation, the range, things like that. And then inferential statistics are how we infer about the population. So descriptive statistics describe or organize our data. Inferential statistics allow us to generalize for the population as a whole. So I just put this chart on here because it might be useful to you guys. And then the last thing I want to make sure that you review is this normal bell curve. There's a few things that you need to familiarize yourself with on this. The most typical being how scores fall from the mean. So the mean is the middle score there. You have to know that approximately 68% of test scores or whatever we're measuring fall within one standard deviation of the mean. So one above and one below, one standard deviation. And then about 90, let me do my math here, 68, 78, 88, about 95, 96% fall within two standard deviations of the mean. So make sure that you recognize that, take some time looking at this. You don't have to memorize the whole thing, just kind of remember those few numbers and then understand what the graphic represents on a normal curve. So that is another thing I would review. All right, bio, another heavy hitter unit. And this one is often complicated because it's super duper sciencey, and sometimes kids struggle with that. So for sure, you need to review the neurons, specifically all the different parts of the neurons, the axons, the terminals, the myelin sheath, all of that stuff, what each thing does or functions as in the neuron, and then how a neuron communicates with other neurons, firing its neurotransmitters across the synapses, things like that. You definitely need to review your neurotransmitters, and I listed the 6 main ones that you should know: acetylcholine, GABA, glutamate, dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. Those are the big ones that often pop up on tests. And so for neurotransmitters, there's 2 things: knowing kind of what its basic purpose is, and then also knowing what a lack of it may do. So like knowing that a lack of something might cause depression or might be linked to Alzheimer's. And so going through the neurotransmitters and just refreshing in your memory what each one does, and then what happens if you're missing it as well. Make sure you review the nervous system, all the different parts of it, and we'll actually go over that in a second. And then the parts of the brain. And I mean, that's hard because there's so many parts of the brain, you just never know which lobe or which part is going to pop up on the test. And so you really have to familiarize yourself with the brain as a whole. So the first thing I want to review is just the idea of neurons firing. We've gone over this in the bio unit, but just to kind of bring this back, remember that a neuron kind of fires like a toilet flushes. Basically, if you just jiggle the handle of a toilet, the threshold isn't reached, and so it can't fire. Same thing with a neuron. You have to reach a certain level for it to actually successfully fire. Just like a toilet, a neuron either fires or it doesn't. It's all or nothing. Basically, you can't half flush a toilet. You can't half fire a neuron. And once it starts, it can't stop. In a neuron and in a toilet, the gross or negative contents are pushed through or removed. And so the negative ions in the neuron travel through and out. And then luckily, a toilet, just like a neuron, can only flush in one direction. It's not multi-directional, and so it all goes the same way outwards. So just kind of, that's a nice analogy, I think, for helping you understand or remember the basic process of a neuron firing. The nervous system then, on the other hand, we did this little dance. So this is, again, review from a previous unit, but we did a little dance to kind of help us remember the parts of the nervous system. So if you haven't seen it yet, this is often helpful, again, like a little mnemonic device to help you remember. And so up on the top here, we have the cat representing the central nervous system because it goes right down the middle. That's our spine and our brain. And then we've got, is that Jimmy Fallon? I think that's Jimmy Fallon. He's doing the jazz hands, which represent our peripheral nervous system. And so that is everything else outwards from our spinal cord. And then our peripheral nervous system is made up of 2 parts. The autonomic, which is represented by Britney Spears there doing her little heartbeat dance, which is just all of the general automatic functions like breathing, heart rate, things like that. And then we've got the people doing the robot over there. That's the somatic nervous system, which has to do with like voluntary movement. And then if we break it down further, we've got the autonomic nervous system made up of 2 parts. The sympathetic nervous system, which is our arousing nervous system, and that's the little chicken doing the Running Man there because he's getting his heart rate up, he's aroused. And then we have the parasympathetic nervous system, which is this lady doing the yoga free pose where you're kind of calming and bringing yourself back down. So make sure you know the nervous system, all of the different parts and all of the different functions of them. Oh, I have to do all this clicking. Okay. And then the last thing from the bio unit, and this is not terribly easy to read, but if you take a screenshot of it, it should be okay. But basically, I think the easiest way to study the brain is by breaking it down into these chunks. And the brainstem, if we start there, that's the oldest structures of the brain. And if you know that, think about what the oldest things as humans we would have. It's our most basic bodily functions that have to do with being alert and awake and alive, basically. So the brainstem is made up of the medulla, which helps us breathe and have a heartbeat, the reticular formation, which gives us arousal and consciousness, and the pons, which coordinates sleep and movement. So, and then we build our way up towards the limbic system. The limbic system is like the middle system that we've developed. And it's made up of the amygdala, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, and all of these have to do with memory, emotion, and maintenance. And then our most newest brain structures would be like the cerebral cortex, which is all of the things that give us higher level functioning, our senses, and things like that. So I just think this is an easier way to study it instead of studying all of the different pieces individually. So if you could make a similar map or concept web of the brain, I think it would be beneficial to you guys for prepping for your final exam. And I'm not sure what's going on. My slides seem to be stuck. Here we go. We'll go to the next one. So then the next unit is sensation versus perception, or sensation and perception, I should say. And so this is like a medium unit. It's 6 to 8% of the AP exam. So probably worth your time, you know, reviewing a good amount for it. This is another pretty technical unit with a lot of like science heavy vocab. And so some of the things I would focus on here is first just understanding the differences between sensation and perception and the processing that goes into them. So make sure you review that. A big part of this unit is thresholds and differences. So understanding why I might hear a certain sound and you might not, even though we're sitting next to each other, or why I may notice a change in smell in the room and you may not. So just understanding that we all have different thresholds and different difference thresholds as well that allow us to experience things differently. And then the two big senses that you should review from this unit are the eye and the ear. You should know a little bit about smell and touch and taste as well, but the eye and the ear are the really heavy hitters in this unit. So make sure you know the parts and the functions of the eye. Make sure you understand the theories behind color vision and how we see. And then understand the Gestalt principles and the things that go into monocular and binocular cues. And then as far as the ear goes, it's kind of the same thing, knowing the parts and knowing the functions, knowing what happens if we have damage to the mechanical systems or the nervous systems, and then we have deficits in our hearing, and then also understanding the theories of pitch that go into hearing. All of those things are going to be important, so I would definitely take some time to review those. We're just going to talk a little bit about the difference between sensation and perception as our quick review for the S&P unit. So remember, sensation is like the starting point. It's our receptors. My nose right now is taking in the stimulus energy from my environment, and then it's converting it into a message to send to my brain. I'm detecting the smell, but I haven't processed it or put anything together yet. That's the sensation aspect. The perception aspect then is when that message reaches my brain organizes the data and makes it into something meaningful, like I smell the chicken cooking downstairs right now. And so the sensation part is that message coming inward and recognizing that there's a smell, and then the perception part is the actual recognition of what that smell is. And then the only other thing from this unit that I threw on the slides here, but I think this is really important, this comes from the Myers textbook, which is the book that I use with my students, is this table. And I think the table can be a really helpful tool for you to just get a really broad summary of the senses and what you need to know for each one. So I would take some time, take a screenshot of this, copy it, and just look it over, because if you have just a really basic understanding of these, it will help you prepare for the exam. All right, states of 2 to 4%. So again, not going to be a heavy hitter, but there are some pretty important concepts in here, so you should definitely take a look and review them. First and foremost, drugs are important in this unit. It's the way we alter our state of consciousness. So just review the various types: barbiturates, opiates, hallucinogens, amphetamines, things like that. Make sure you review the different types of drugs and understand what the functions are. If they bring you up, if they bring you down, what do they do to your nervous system, that sort of thing. Another big aspect of this unit would be sleep patterns. So Make sure you review the sleep stages, NREM 1, NREM 2, NREM 3, and REM. Know what's happening at each stage and how we progress through it throughout the night. That would be important. And then lastly, just kind of refresh your memory about dreaming and the different functions or theories behind why we dream. I particularly highlighted the sleep stages because I think they're probably the most important thing from this unit. And so just understanding here that we oscillate through these different stages throughout the night. NREM 1 is kind of our half awake, half asleep stage, and you can see that the brain waves are slowing down in NREM 1. NREM 2, the waves are getting deeper, and so they're more relaxed. NREM 3 is like our deep, deep sleep. We call it delta waves, so delta, deep. I think that's a useful way to remember those. And then REM is when we're dreaming, which is almost like an in-between sleep and awake state because our mind is aroused, but our body is asleep. So just review those. Know that we cycle through those every 90 or so minutes. And as the night progresses, this is important, the REM stage gets longer. We get less of the NREM 3 and we get more of the REM because our body gets rested. All right, and then the last unit that we have to kind of talk about for review is the learning unit. We just went over this. And there's three main things from the learning unit: classical conditioning. So make sure you know what a conditioned stimulus is, what a neutral stimulus is, how it works, all of that stuff. And then operant conditioning would be another key factor. Make sure you know reinforcements, punishments, schedules of reinforcement, those sorts of things. And then observational learning, equally as important. So those are kind of the three factors that go into the learning unit. And specifically, I think the little Albert experiment gives us a good look at particularly classical conditioning. It's got all of the phases. So we start with something called a neutral stimulus, which is a white rat. And the little baby has no fear of the rat. It's just a normal, he actually likes it and he plays with it. We also have something called an unconditioned stimulus, which is like a really loud noise. And how is a baby going to respond to a really loud noise? By crying or having fear. And so that's just how we start. Neutral, the rat means nothing to the baby. Loud noise, scary to the baby. Eventually, what happens, this acquisition phase, is that once the baby starts to touch the rat, every time he reaches out for it, we make the loud noise and make the baby cry and fearful. And so after the conditioning has taken place, this neutral stimulus, the white rat, has become a conditioned stimulus because just the sight of the white rat causes fear and anxiety in little baby Albert. And so that's the gist of classical conditioning. Generalization could also occur, and it did in this experiment. Basically, little Albert's fears generalized to all fluffy animals. It wasn't just the rat. Any sort of fluffy animal, and even masks and stuffed animals, caused him great fear. And eventually we can assume that extinction would occur, that if every time he saw a fluffy animal we stopped making a loud banging noise, he would lose the response of fear over time. So this is a good way, I think, for you to just remember all of the pieces of classical conditioning. The other thing that you need to understand is classical versus operant conditioning. Just make sure you differentiate between the two factors. In classical conditioning, our response happens second. So there's some sort of a stimulus and then our response. And in operant conditioning, we do something and then there's like a stimulus or a treat given to us. So it's behavior then consequence. And then the other big factor is that anything in classical conditioning must be reflexive, automatic sort of response. It has to be natural. And in operant conditioning, it's a voluntary behavior. So again, just kind of little ways to help you differentiate and remember between the two. All right, so moving on to our free response question. So typically, each unit, when I give free response questions, I'm just giving my students a question that pertains to the actual unit we're in. But when it gets time for the AP test or studying for finals, then that's going to be a cumulative FRQ. So there's going to be terms on it from multiple units. So before we jump into the content, let's just really briefly review the CHUG SOTAs acronym. So remember to be concise in your writing, get to the point, and talk about what you need to talk about. You have to use pen legible handwriting. I was actually reading something. Studies show that your handwriting can actually, like on things like the ACT, can actually cost you points just because if you look really sloppy, it's like the person reading it automatically like kind of thinks of you as like a sloppy person. And so they might not think as highly of your intelligence. So focus on having good handwriting. I know we're not going to all have perfect handwriting, but work on writing legibly. Always, always, always underline whatever vocab word or term you're talking about, and then make sure you get rid of the extra stuff. You don't need an intro and you don't need a conclusion. When you're writing, excuse me, remember to put space between each section or each paragraph. So each term should have its own paragraph, and then you should have a space between them. It's just easier for the person reading or grading your paper to go in and visually see when a new idea starts, and it will help them in scoring you more fairly. Always go in the order of the prompt, again, just so the person reading it doesn't get confused and it doesn't end up costing you points. Always define the term, always apply the term to whatever the situation is, and use synonyms when appropriate. So our prompt for today is, at a school-wide pep rally at Polk High School, each grade has a designated t-shirt color and seating area in the bleachers. Student leaders organize classes so their colored shirts combine to form the school flag. The coach gives an exciting speech. The cheerleaders perform an upbeat routine, and the band plays the school song while the students sing in unison. Explain the behavior and perceptions of the participants in the pep rally using the concepts below. Be sure to apply the concepts to the scenario in your explanation. So my first term is cocktail party effect, and I'm going to just kind of type here. I'm going to go into the edit mode right along on this slide, and you can just kind of follow along my thought process. I hope this size font is big enough. Maybe I'll go a little bigger. Plus 18. Okay, so my first term is cocktail party effect, and I'm just going to jump right into a definition. The cocktail party effect, let me look. Effect, my bad. Cocktail party effect, and then I should underline it because that's my term so that we see what it is. The cocktail party effect refers to the phenomenon that occurs in crowded spaces. We are able to eliminate or disregard no, external is not a good. Eliminate or disregard other stimuli while focusing or attending. Gosh, I'm sorry, my typing's terrible. Focusing or attending to one particular person or stimulus. So that's my definition. I'm talking about the cocktail party effect. It allows me to like focus my attention on one given thing, even though I'm in this gym with this like crazy loud pep rally going on. So now I need to give an example of how this may relate to the prompt. So in this example, the cocktail party effect, they come into play as I try to talk to my friend during the pep rally. Even though the band is playing loudly and others are singing, I am able to focus my selective attention, that's a good way of throwing in a vocab word, on my friend and hear what she is saying while tuning out the background noise. So that would be a good answer for a variety of reasons. First, I started by defining the term, and I gave a definition in my own words. That's important. Try to put the definition in your own words while remaining accurate. Then I jumped right into talking about the situation. So you have to talk about like the pep rally and how the pep rally may make the cocktail effect come into play. And so I talk about how, you know, even though it's loud in the gym because of the band and the music, I'm able to still turn and talk to my friend because I can focus my attention on just her and block out that external stimuli. So that would be a really good answer for that question. I'm going to make another slide. Just duplicate it and then erase this. So then for the next term, let's go back and look at the question. We have to talk about the sympathetic nervous system and how that would relate to what's happening in the pep rally. And so we again would just start with a basic definition. The sympathetic nervous system is part of our body's autonomic nervous system. It is responsible for getting us alert, ready, or excited in response to events in our environment. So that's my definition of sympathetic nervous system. There we go, I'm underlining it. Now, how does the sympathetic nervous system relate to what I'm specifically talking about at the pep rally? So, let's say I'm a football player listening to my coach give a speech at the pep rally. So the sympathetic nervous system could be related to the pep rally for a football player. As the football player listens to their coach giving an impassioned speech, they become excited or aroused. You can use either term, excited or aroused, for the upcoming game. The sympathetic nervous system kicks in and increases their breathing and heart rate as a signal of this excitement. Is 2 words. Okay, so I again defined the word. I didn't put any fluffy intro or conclusion. Underlined the word, gave a definition, and then I thought of a way to relate it back to the pep rally. And you can add, in FRQs, you can add extra information. So you're not tied to just what's in the prompt. So I brought up a football player because he wasn't specifically mentioned in the prompt, but I wanted to relate it to the coach in the speech. So you can add in extra information as long as you're still tying it back to whatever the prompt is telling you to do. So that would be fine, and that would score. So we'll make one more slide and do the third term. So if we go back one last time and look, our last term is observational learning. And so we have to figure out how we're going to relate observational learning to this pep rally and what's happening. So go back to my slide here. We start like always with observational learning is, and we'll underline that, is a way that people acquire information. So I'm trying to avoid saying learning by watching instead of observing others' actions. That's my definition. It can be short and sweet. It doesn't have to be very long. And so now I have to relate it to the pep assembly. So I might say something like, maybe there's a foreign exchange student. So we'll say, as a Polk High School has an exchange student from Iceland. In Iceland, they do not have school pep assemblies. However, the exchange student observes her peers participating in the pep assembly and follows suit by standing up and cheering at appropriate times. Therefore, observational observational learning has occurred. So that could be another way. So I added in again in this time more information, but I still tied it to the PEP assembly in some way, shape, or form. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense to you. Hopefully seeing me kind of talk through and write out different FRQ responses has given you a little bit of help towards writing your own. And then the only other thing we need to cover tonight is just, again, the multiple choice strategy. I know we've gone over this before, but I really want to stress this. When you're multiple choice testing, never skip questions. It's really, especially on a long multiple choice test, it's really easy then to miss like a bubble. And then you get off on your answer sheet, and then all of your answers are wrong. So I would just never skip. I would just guess and maybe put like a little star or something next to it. So if you do have time, you can go back to it. Things that are also useful is like annotating the text. I know you don't have a ton of time, but like if you know for sure an answer is wrong, cross it off immediately. It just helps you visually take in the question better. Try to underline the main idea or concept, especially because some of these questions are like almost a paragraph long. They get a little bit wordy. And so try and like for yourself, kind of pick out what that key point is, especially if it's like a vocab term, because a lot of times that's what the questions are getting at, is they're trying to get you to a specific point, a specific vocab word. And so if you can highlight that or pick it out right away, it will help you answer the question. Another big thing is just stick with your gut. Like, don't go back and change answers like at the end of a test unless you have like a good reason to, like, oh yeah, now I remember this thing. But don't just like waffle back and forth. Usually your gut's right. And then lastly, if you're running out of time, you only have a minute left, quickly bubble in the last answers, but don't skip around, you know, bubble all A's or all B's or all C's or whatever, because you have a greater chance of getting answers correct that way. So that is kind of my prep or my review for you guys for the semester final. Again, I'm happy to answer other questions. If you go on the Facebook page and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm studying bio and I just don't understand split brain or something like that, I'll respond. I'll help you out. I want you guys to do well. Otherwise, we will see you guys next week. Remember to tell your friends, tell your classmates, tell everyone about the big semester Kahoot review. We want to have a ton of people participating and making it as fun as possible. So I will see you guys then. Possibly next week I might hang out at the Kahoot. Otherwise, I'll for sure see you then in January when we get back from winter break and we start talking about cognition. All right, see you later. Bye.